Tonight's program, as everybody can see, we have exploring diversity in the multiple sclerosis community, a very, very strong, needed topic for dialogue. And, if we could do this every day of the week, it wouldn't be enough for what we actually have to do. For everybody to please know that my name is Stuart Schlossman. I'm president and founder of MS Views and News. And tonight's program, like I said, is the Exploring Diversity. We are sponsored tonight by EMD Serono and Genentech and Biogen. So virtually, we want to give them all a round of applause, right? And thank them for what they're doing. All right, tonight's presenters, interesting. We have Sheila Thorne. Sheila Thorne specializes in multicultural healthcare, as you can read. Sheila has spent almost 3 decades designing marketing, media, and health education campaigns for healthcare organizations and the top 50 pharmaceutical companies from molecule to market. Sheila has worked on behalf of the healthcare industry throughout North America, Western Europe, and Latin America with a focus on communities of color. She teaches and has lectured on health equity and cultural competency at several universities and has given over 250 keynote presentations. She's worked on workshops. She worked with us in the past on cultural differences. And, Sheila is going to be presenting first. But before she does, I want to speak with all of you because I also want to introduce our second speaker, and that's Mitzi Williams. All right, Dr. Mitzi Williams is board-certified neurologist and fellowship-trained multiple sclerosis specialist who serves as the founder and CEO of the Joy Life Wellness Group Multiple Sclerosis Center in Newnan, I always say Newman, but it's Newnan, Georgia. That's N-E-W-N-A-N. She is considered a subject matter expert in neurology, multiple sclerosis, and health disparities. Dr. Williams has over 15 years of experience in the field of multiple sclerosis. She received her undergraduate degree in neuroscience and behavioral biology from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and received her doctorate of medicine degree from Morehouse School of Medicine, also in Atlanta, Georgia. She's completed her internal medicine internship, neurology residency, and multiple sclerosis fellowship at Georgia Health Sciences University. There is so much to say more of both of these presenters. I don't have time because it's just like books of that we could do. But I do want to let everybody know just briefly like what we've got going on here tonight. So both presenters have something that they're going to speak with you about individually first. Dr. Williams is going to talk about sharing a clinical perspective about the topics that we have for tonight. Sheila Thorne is going to speak about sharing a general historic to current day perspective on the topics as well. They have different topics that they're going to be speaking about with diversity, health disparities, understanding the historical impacts of different things, and they're going to speak with each other about this as well. So we're going to speak for about 40 minutes in total, all right? Now, at the end of that 40 minutes, we're going to open the floor up to the Q&A. So for now, though, Sheila, I want to give you the microphone.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone.
Thank you very much.
And welcome to this very important program. It is my pleasure and honor to have been invited to be a part of this dialogue, this conversation. And I am thrilled to meet Dr. Mitzi Williams, who has done amazing work in the field of MS. As Stuart said, I've been working in the multicultural space for almost 30 years, and my work has been predominantly with pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, medical device companies. I'm based in New York. I was born, but my life has been certainly affected by chronic disease. And as a woman of color, it clearly became apparent to me that many of the companies who are doing incredible research and producing amazing products were unfortunately not having success in reaching out to communities of color. My specialty is people of Black, Latino, Asian, and Native American populations. And I've had the privilege of working in all of these populations throughout North America, South America, and Western Europe. Well, we are clearly at a watershed moment. The COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the murder of George Floyd back in the year 2020, catapulted us into a closer look about the persistent and pervasive societal inequities and injustices that people of color have endured for a very long time. And it certainly is apparent when you look at health and healthcare. So my job, my life's work, and my passion is to help organizations better be more effective in reaching out to communities of color. There is a deep level of mistrust, distrust of government, of huge companies, and certainly of the medical profession because of research abuse. And unfortunately, that's why many people of color are reluctant and often resistant to participating in clinical research. But Dr. Williams is going to tell you that that certainly is not something that we want to encourage. We want people to really understand what it's all about. But let me give you perspective. Let's step back, because as we look at our great country, we see that the people of color are burgeoning with regards to the population. I first saw the numbers change with the Census 2000, but they really began to change in Census 2010, where you could check 2 or more races or ethnicities on the census. And here we are, just now receiving some of the results from Census 2020. There is no doubt that we are experiencing a diversity explosion in this country. And that certainly, definitely has to be considered when we're talking about how to help people get better health care, how to help them navigate the healthcare system, how to help them understand if race and ethnicity is a part of what they need to consider from the provider perspective, as well as from the patient perspective. So although the census is just coming out slowly, it's not going back the way it was before. In 1960, America was 80% white. Today, those numbers have dramatically changed. And so it's very important that we see the need to really address the unique needs and concerns of these communities. Next slide, Bill. Once you take a look at how these numbers have changed, here's what we have to conclude. Next slide, Bill. Listen to this report.
More pluralistic and multiracial country than we have ever measured before. We had the only white population decline in absolute numbers for the first time ever since the very first census back in 1790. The population of people who identify as only white in the United States, so that's not white in something else, but just white, shrank in absolute numbers. We've never seen this in the history of the United States. The number of people who are identified as multicultural jumped significantly from about 9 million or so in the last census in 2010 to over 33 million this time, a more than threefold increase. We also saw growth in demographic groups like, for example, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, who are a really diverse group of people coming from a lot of different cultures and who are now becoming a bigger and bigger part of America. What we really saw in the numbers this time around, in fact, was that the growth in the American population is really coming from minorities and marginalized communities, and they're really driving the population increases in the United States, not just over the past decade, but presumably in years to come for this country as well. Another notable item from the census is that while the U.S. population is still growing, that growth is slowing down. So we saw, in fact, the slowest rate of growth since the 1930s, since the throes of the Great Depression in this country. That slower rate of growth has implications for a lot of things. Economically, for example, it potentially means fewer workers in the United States in years to come. So that's something that we're really going to see reverberate throughout American society.
So these numbers that are growing, it definitely shows that we are really not a melting pot, but we are a cultural, beautiful mosaic, a patchwork quilt, where everybody comes together and they tenaciously hold on to their culture, their traditions, their language, while they make up being a part of the whole. So there's no doubt that we more and more, faster and faster, are becoming multicultural. Well, what does that have to do with healthcare? Well, here's a statement from the Pharmaceutical Council. Because of this diversity, there's a need for individualized pharmaceutical treatment because there have been significant differences among racial and ethnic categories with regards to new drugs, metabolism, clinical effectiveness, side effects, all apparently are different because of race. Next slide, Bill. But many people say, you know, I don't see color. I'm not a racist. I treat everybody the same. Well, being colorblind is not necessarily a good thing because that denies culture. That stops the conversation. Rather, we want to recognize, acknowledge, respect, and celebrate our differences. And all of the challenges we have in doing that, we can better address when we admit that we are together. We are very thankful and grateful to be American, but we do have differences. And that's one of the challenges that we have as a country. And we certainly have made improvement, but there's a lot more work to do. Next slide. So let's talk about equity. Stuart mentioned it in his opening remarks, is really becoming the forefront. We talk about health disparities where people of color get sick earlier, younger, suffer more, die sooner. But equity is a different concept. It's so that everybody has the equal chance of achieving their optimal health. Well, how does that happen? Well, we know we're all equal, but how can we overcome the systemic, structural, institutional barriers that seem to drive the disparities? That's the work at hand. That's the hard work, but that's the important work that makes it an imperative to celebrate culture. Next slide. And here are some of the things that equity means. But is health equity possible? Can everybody achieve their health? Hit it again, please, Bill. Well, clearly, there are ways that we can overcome these barriers and empower those who may have an illness or a condition, but certainly, significantly, race remains the most significant factor in determining whether you get care, whether you receive high quality care, and in determining health outcomes. So we can't avoid it, folks. Race, ethnicity, and culture are something we have to address proactively so that at least health equity becomes a reality. It's not elusive. Next slide. And therefore, the disparities become front and center. Health disparities, differences in health outcomes. Healthcare disparities, differences in access and coverage. But why do these exist? Well, the documentation is clear. Next slide. Because this is not new. These injustices and disparities have been in existence for a very long time. And what we're learning, realistically, is that the better predictors of outcomes is really driven by the social determinants of health. Where you live, work, play, and pray will be to a large factor determine the kind of care you get, where you get the care, and the quality. So it's about your employment. It's about your neighborhood. It's about your education, food. It's about community and social context. It's about the healthcare system. But you notice that line in the middle? We must and courageously face racism and discrimination, which also has been part of what has determined who gets care, how they get care, and where they get care. Next slide. And these social determinants are predominantly the factors that will determine your health outcomes. 40% of these socioeconomic factors go towards determining persons who need care. And certainly multiple sclerosis is one of those diseases that is definitely impacted by the social determinants. I have some friends of color who have MS, and I know some of the challenges they face, not only with the condition, but also being of color. News has certainly helped me learn a lot more about these populations. And I'm sure Dr. Williams will talk a little bit about what her clinical experience has demonstrated as well. Next slide. But the real documentation happened in 1985, the famous Malone-Heckler report. Definitely Margaret Heckler, who was then head of health education and welfare, the old agency, and Thomas Malone, who was a biostatistician with NIH. They pulled together a report, and it conclusively said, next slide, that people of color receive less than optimal care. But fast forward to the year 2002, when the National Academy of Medicine commissioned the National Academy of Medicine to issue the IOM report, the Institute of Medicine, I should say the National Academy of Sciences. And again, it was the same finding. People of color receive less than quality care. This was different because they surveyed insured people of color, middle income people of color. So it wasn't just about poverty. Next slide. And so the movement began from cultural sensitivity, which you all I'm sure have heard of, to cultural competency. That's a different dynamic. Sensitivity is passive. That's just a recognition that there are differences. But competency means you not only recognize the difference, but you respond appropriately to them. That's the arena that we're in now. Are we culturally competent? Is the system culturally competent? Are providers culturally competent? So if you do go to them for care, are you treated with respect? Are you treated with understanding? Do they celebrate your culture? That's the key question that we're struggling and challenged with now. Next slide. And so cultural competence is defined as systemic or individual. So the system itself has to really make sure that it has the cultural competency to engage people of color. And the providers, the physicians who are treating us, have to look more at their own biases, their own implicit bias, unconscious bias, and make sure that they're culturally competent. So no matter who comes to them, no matter what they look like, what language they speak, or where they come from, they're given appropriate care. Next slide. And when we look at the clinical trial, and I hope this is a segue to Dr. Williams, we need to do a lot more work here. Unfortunately, people of color are not participating in the numbers equal to their percentage in the population. That's been going on for a long time. And that has affected the quality of the health care that providers can suggest to their clients. We need to fix that. Next slide. But probably the best example of how we can work at it is when we look at what happened with COVID-19, as people were dying in front of our faces. In my career, in my experience, this was the closest we've ever come to equal participation of people of color. What did they do different? They were more aggressive. They were more in community. They were more in your face. They were educating people. And clearly that made a difference. So it's possible to increase diversity in clinical research. I'm ecstatic. I'm very hopeful that if we can do it for this, we can do it for MS. Next slide. And so that's really the conclusion of my presentation, because I want to make sure that you understand this is the time where research imperative, diversity imperative is an imperative. It's no longer an afterthought. It cannot be left until you have the time and the money. The urgency is now, because too many people of color are dying unnecessarily, suffering unnecessarily from treatable, manageable disease. So it's all of us together. We may have come here in different boats, but we're in the same boat now. And we've got to come together to fix this so that all Americans can reach their optimal health. And that means healthy families, healthy communities, and a healthy country. So I hope that gives you context and the urgency and the importance behind the work that amazing providers like Dr. Williams does. So I'm going to have her come on and give you her perspective clinically about how the work in MS is progressing, but what more we need to do. Dr. Williams, welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I mean, gosh, I am so fired up by that presentation, Sheila, and I can't wait until we get into our discussion. So many salient points that hopefully I will be able to expound upon a little bit. When we think about MS in the United States, right, we talk about different populations that are affected. And traditionally, MS has been thought of as a young white woman's disease. And although globally, that's still the primary group that develops MS, here in the U.S., there are studies that suggest that the incidence of MS is actually highest in people of African descent, and that the risk may be up to 47% higher in Black women. And this is really counterintuitive to what many of us in the neurology field have learned over time. This is just a graphic from one of the studies that was published in 2012, looking at the Kaiser data from Southern California. And when we look, we can basically see that the incidence, the number of people per 100,000 with MS is highest in the Black population, which is in the green bars. And we see on the left, that first graphic is the total number of people. And then when we see it broken down into women, which is in the middle graphic, versus men, we can see there's a little less of a difference with the men. So it's pretty similar between the white population and the Black population. But when we look at the middle graphic with women, we can see there's a bigger difference between the white and Black populations. And that's what leads to that 47% increased risk number. So one of the biggest issues when we think scientifically is how do we determine ethnicity, right? So we know that race affects outcomes, right? But race is really a social construct. It doesn't tell us about biology. And so, we basically determine race based on phenotype, what people look like. And for our scientific studies, it's basically what people identify as. And as Sheila mentioned earlier with the census, now there is much more diversity now that people are able to, pick more than one box, so to speak. But in many of our research studies, people are forced to check one box, which may really be missing some of the underlying characteristics of different mixed race populations. So one of the ways that we really kind of understand if there are biologic differences in different people groups is to really look at things on a genetic level and not necessarily look at them just in terms of race, which is often self-identified. Next slide. So, when we think about this problem, again, Sheila showed some numbers about participation in clinical trials, right, which is low across the board for most diseases. If we think about hypertension, diabetes, diseases that are very common in minority populations, we don't see large participants from minority groups in clinical research. When we think about MS clinical trials, those numbers are even lower. So when we think about the data, right, we have all this data that suggests that the risk is higher, that the occurrence of MS is higher in certain groups. So when we look at the literature or the amount of information we have about these populations, it's very little. So this was a study that I was fortunate to co-author back in 2014 and 15, where we looked at basically just kind of all the literature that's published about MS that's in English. And out of 52,000 articles that are written in English, 60,000 articles written around the world, a little over 100 were about Black people with MS, and less than 25 were about Hispanic Latino populations. Now, these numbers have improved, but they still represent a very small percentage of the actual literature on MS. So when we look at things like outcomes and why people may do worse, we really don't have a good understanding because we don't have the research to help us understand these outcomes. Next slide. So what about disparities in neurologic care, right? So again, the issues related to health disparities that have become very to the forefront during COVID are not new, as Sheila so eloquently said. This was a study from 2017 looking at all neurologic diseases and who basically had access to care. And what they found was that when they looked at Black patients, they were 30% less likely to see a neurologist for a neurologic condition. So this included a wealth of neurologic conditions such as MS, stroke, seizures, Parkinson's disease, etc. They're 30% less likely to actually see a neurologist for a neurologic condition. Also more likely to go to the ER, more likely to have inpatient hospital stays, and higher hospital expenses, right? So there's a lot of tax on the system because people don't have access to routine care with neurologists. So what is the path forward? So we certainly need to do things like improve targeted education, which Sheila has so eloquently mentioned. We also need to encourage self-advocacy, which is one of my personal goals. And I know a large part of the work that Stuart does is to make sure people are educated about research options, understand what's going on. I think also increasing access to available resources is important. For instance, there are many resources that are available for things like free transportation to doctor's visits. Also, when we think about many of our clinical research studies, there may be options for transportation to, those research visits. There's often support for medications if people have a loss of insurance. But if you don't know about those resources, you can't access them. And then also, I think we also need to promote or talk about the importance of research participation because, when we think of research, it often gets a bad rep, right? Many people think about things like, they don't want to be a guinea pig, which is a valid concern. And certainly clinical trials are not for everyone. But, there are also many benefits to clinical research. It's the cutting edge of medicine, right? There are often new therapies, new breakthroughs that occur because of clinical research. Also, you get access usually to top-notch care at very well-established centers, that specialize in certain conditions. In some cases, the medications may be free or testing may be free. So there are a lot of advantages. And then also, of course, there's a piece about helping the community, right? Being counted as part of the process, right? So that we can make sure that whatever treatments we create are really able to help and affect everyone living with that condition. And then, of course, it's also important for us to raise awareness in the medical community about the importance of diversity and not to keep continuing the same patterns and not asking people to be a part of the research process. Next slide. I won't go over social determinants of health because I think that Sheila covered these very well. But again, these do affect access to medical services, and they do affect health outcomes, things like education, socioeconomic status, transportation, etc. So what are some factors that can affect the care of underrepresented groups with multiple sclerosis specifically? Again, looking at things like socioeconomic status, certainly a person's ability to access care, especially with the specialty center, that may in some cases be several hours away from where they live, can be an issue. Also, distrust of the medical community, rightfully so, because people, we do have a historic, interaction with the medical system with unfair experimentation. And also people do experience continued racism and discrimination today when they're interacting with the medical system. Also, religious and cultural beliefs must be respected by healthcare providers, right? And how they play a part, as well as family relationships play a part in the care taking and decision-making process. And then, of course, poor diversity in clinical trials. Most of our trials for multiple sclerosis are conducted primarily in Eastern Europe. And believe it or not, with the issues that are going on in the Ukraine, it has significantly affected many major clinical research trials, and so it's important for us to also, discuss that it's not just a problem for the doctors and patients to solve. It's a broader problem. Industry partners, pharmaceutical companies that are conducting trials need to make sure that they're conducting them in places where they can reach underrepresented populations, right? And not just doing the same things over and over again and getting the same results. So what am I hopeful for? So I also, like Sheila, am very hopeful for the future, right? So certainly we saw many successes with the trials for COVID-19, but we also are making some strides in the MS community to increase diversity in clinical research. The MS Minority Research Engagement Partnership Network is a very unique group of patient advocates, researchers, physicians, industry partners, advocacy group representatives that all kind of sit together and said, what can we do to help increase awareness about diversity in research? And there's several toolkits that we developed for researchers about cultural competency and increasing diversity, as well as educational programs for patients to better understand the research process. Also, when we think about clinical trials, we discussed this already, so we can go to the next slide. So another thing that I'm very excited about is the National African Americans with MS Multiple Sclerosis Registry, which went live, so to speak, in September of 2020, and is hoping to, gather information to better understand patterns of treatment if people have adequate access to care, what types of medications they're being treated with, and the time from symptoms to diagnosis. So hopefully this is an effort that myself and several of my colleagues have been working on for many years that finally came to fruition. And we're hoping to better understand some of these outcomes by looking at some of the data for the registry, and the website is there if you're interested in registering and filling out the questionnaires. You can stay connected to me. This is all my information. I'm the Nerdy Neurologist. Next slide. And I think that's it. Okay, so thank you guys so much for listening to that brief presentation. And, I will invite Sheila back up so we can have a little bit of a discussion about some of the things that, she presented, as well as some of the things I presented, and solutions. I have, something that I'd like to discuss, Sheila, that you touched on that was so interesting. When we talk about trial participation, I loved what you said about having this sense of urgency. And one of the things that I have been trying to convey to many of my colleagues and many of, our industry partners, those who help create trials, is that this is not something that is just we don't want to make it seem like we're blaming the patients for not participating. So I really have been trying to kind of steer the language toward enrollment, right? We have low enrollment. And I know it's a little bit of a nuance, but sometimes when we say people don't, there's no participation, it kind of almost makes it seem like the whole reason that we don't see it is because people don't want to participate. And to an extent, that's true. But there are larger barriers that can prevent, participation in clinical trials, such as where the trials are conducted, right? So if we keep going to the same centers that aren't recruiting diverse populations, not going into the community where these people, where people live, where there are neurologists who are trusted voices, not looking at researchers who are participants or part of the people groups that we're trying to reach, we often can miss a lot. And then I think another thing that I try to convey is we also need to look at the way that we design our trials. Are we automatically excluding people because our trials are so strict that we're missing populations that have comorbidities, right? And we know that Black and Brown groups tend to have more comorbidities like diabetes, high blood pressure, et cetera. And if you got to be in perfect health to be in that trial, you're just going to knock people off, right off the top. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, you hit on so many important points, Dr. Williams, and I completely agree with you. I'll even go so far as to tell you when I travel around the country and talk to groups of color, they don't even like the word trial. Clinical trial means something different to them. It's become a legal and a judicial kind of concept. So I use clinical study because that seems to give it a different tone to it. But the education is so critically important. And oh my goodness, you talk about the protocol for the trials, the inclusion, exclusion criteria, which are daunting. And sometimes I read some of that, Dr. Williams, and I say, I don't know where you're going to find these Black people. I mean, because they're so strict.
Right.
So I think the institutional review boards, as you have well talked about, or where we have to start with some education. Do they have to be so restrictive to negatively impact outcomes? So I think we need to have that conversation. But the whole thing about clinical trials is there's such a low level of education. People automatically say, well, they're not in it because of Tuskegee. No, that's become a metaphor for the worst research. But sometimes people say, my doctor's never asked me to be in a clinical trial. Have you heard that?
Yes, absolutely. And there actually was a study that was published called the Tuskegee Legacy Project, right? Where they asked maybe about 1,000 people, okay, if you're not involved in research, is it because of Tuskegee? And they asked maybe like 200 or 300 Black people, 200 or 300 Hispanic people, maybe 500 or 600 white people. Half the people didn't even know what it was. You know what I mean? Exactly. So it's not Tuskegee specifically, but it's something more pervasive, as you said. Definitely something more, but it's not Tuskegee. If I hear Tuskegee one more time.
Exactly. I mean, really, I feel the same way. Stop using that as an excuse because the young people that I speak to have never heard about it. I mean, the older generation remembers that, and you still hear this stuff about guinea pig. Isn't it more about mistrust of the government, mistrust of science that has been so negative and egregious, and even contemporary experiences in trying to get into the healthcare system where they're dismissed because of their pain, where they're ostracized because, it's felt like, oh, Black people, you're just hypersensitive. You're just being drama queens. Can't be that bad. So I think our education has to start not only with patients, but with physicians. And that's difficult for many physicians to accept. What's your experience in talking to physicians?
Yeah, so I think that, when educating physicians, I think the first approach that I have to do is approach with the data, right? So everybody wants to know about the data. They don't want to know about feelings and all of that stuff. So the fact that we now have some studies that are coming to the forefront that suggest the prevalence of MS is higher. We have many studies that suggest the outcomes are worse, even to the point of things like mortality. I think that, people are coming around at least to the point where we need to pay attention. The
Yes.
difficulty with, cultural competency is, in many cases, there are many of my colleagues who are like, gosh, I didn't know that this was this big of an issue. Tell me how I can help, and there are some that you won't be able to reach, right? So
That's
I
right.
realize that, there are some that despite our best efforts, we may not change their mind and the way they practice.
Right.
But I think that we
Right.
really have an opportunity with our trainees, right? Those that are coming along, in the medical system to make sure that they start at a different set point than what we did, when I was coming along, and make sure that we're educating them about bias, implicit bias, but also explicit, right? Because all bias is not
That's exactly
unconscious, right? A lot
That's
of bias
exactly
is
right.
conscious. People look at people and make certain decisions, and they're aware
That's
of
right.
those decisions, So I think that we
That's
have
right.
to call a spade, as my mom would say,
Oh,
and
yes.
certainly make sure we're looking at unconscious, but also assessing and addressing conscious bias and how it really does affect outcomes.
Yeah, and you also said something that, I wrote it down and I put 3 exclamation points after it, and that is the targeted education. And it's not just the brochure, it's not just the pamphlet, it's really getting into the community and understanding the unique needs and concerns of the population. It may not be that I don't want to be in the trial, but maybe I can't. I have a job where I can't get time off to go for my visit. And the medical center may be too far away. I remember doing one trial or participating in the recruitment of one trial. The medical center, you had to take 3 buses to get there. So it wasn't even in the community. So the participants said, I want to do it. And you know what? When we went to the center and told them that, they did have a bus, but it stopped running at 5 o'clock. So if I had to leave work and go to this, how am I going to get home if I don't have a car? So I think those trial educators and coordinators need to look at all the dynamics that might impact this population. What about childcare? What about elder care?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All of those factors will prevent one from being in a trial.
Right. And I think the word that I have really been saying over and over and over again is intention, right? Indeed. So we can't make all the protocols, pick all the sites, do everything, and then come back and say, hey, Sheila, hey, Dr. Mitzi, how do we fix it and make it more diverse?
Yes,
right? We have to look at it from the ground up, right?
Exactly.
How do we design the study? So there is a study that we just finished enrolling for called the CHIME study, which is the first African-American and Hispanic trial in MS, right? So just Black and Hispanic people are in the trial. And we had to look at things like this from the protocol. How can we provide childcare? What kind of stipend can we give? People are missing work, right? Are there things we can do remotely, right? If nothing, COVID has taught us that all kinds of things that we said we couldn't do at home, you can absolutely do at home. So what kind of assessments can we do remotely so we can decrease the burden on people to come in? And what we found was we not only completed enrollment for the trial ahead of schedule in a pandemic, right? But we over-enrolled for the study. And so I think it's such a testament to if you approach things, and also we included patients in that creation of the protocol, right? So it's not just enough for us as scientists to say, we know what you need. We have to ask, as you said, go into those communities, ask people what the gaps are, and then address those gaps instead of assuming that we know what's needed and making up our own solutions that aren't effective for the population.
So true, so true. And I see examples of that all the time, in terms of even the keeping people in the trial. What is your retention program? Because the dropout rate sometimes is prohibitive as well. And we know you've got to have certain numbers to make things statistically significant, but you can't just recruit them and leave them. You've got to make sure that you have a culture of trust, that you have resources that they can go to. You have opportunities, because unfortunately, most of the principal investigators and the clinical research teams don't look like these populations. So how can you make it welcoming for me to come, every month in terms of getting my meds and getting my stats and all of that? Technology is a beautiful thing, but I partner with Black physicians organizations, Black nurses, Hispanic nurses. So even if you can't have them on your team, have them come in the day that the patients are going to be in, okay? And make sure that they see somebody who looks like them. So how do you lessen the burden of the trial and make it a positive experience? Because you get the best care, you're personalized in terms of one-on-one. So that's one of the benefits you mentioned that we have to emphasize, that there are no guarantees. However, there have been safety measures put in place after the many Tuskegees. And you know, Dr. Williams, there's been more than one Tuskegee, okay?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's not new. So we've
It's
got to make
not.
sure that we proactively address the concerns in a respectful way. You know, not
Absolutely.
again, as you said, blaming the patient, but can you create a welcoming environment for these patients and use the community resources to help you with transportation? If I have a question, who do I call? You know, my sister
Right.
used to be in clinical trials, and the nurses were the ones that they called. They felt comfortable talking to the nurses. I got pastors involved, you know, so you can talk about the trial in church. And I got business owners to look at. So this is a deviation from the norm. You know, this is not
Right.
the norm with regards to clinical research. But I don't know about you, but I don't think you have an option. I think if we
I
really
agree.
want to improve the quality of care, you've got to think about, now it may cost more, it may take longer, but that's not a cost. It's an investment. And it's an investment in the health of our nation, isn't it? I mean, that's the way I look at it.
Absolutely. I do
Yeah.
too. And, you know, that's one of the other things that I talk about often is investment, even investment in, you know, researchers, right? People who are in communities who don't have all of the, you know, tools and the backup of many of our big academic institutions, who want to do research, who want to reach out to their community, but may need a little extra help getting
Yes.
started. You know, so it's important to invest in those centers, right, that are in the community. Even if you come up with some model where maybe they're a sub-site, right, where they can conduct part of the trial and be in partnership with larger places. We just have to think outside of the box, because if we keep doing the same thing, we'll keep getting the same results, right? And we'll be in the same place, you know. And one of the things that really kind of sparked my passion to focus on this as a part of my career was I went to the National Minority Equality Forum, and I was given a lecture about MS in the African American community. And, you know, I gave this talk, everybody was patting me on the back, and I got on the plane and realized I've been saying the same thing for 10 years. Nothing had changed. I had more studies that said the same thing. And I just had this aha moment, like, we've got to move the needle. And in order to move the needle, we have to look at things in a unique way, and we have to get outside of that box and do things differently.
And you said something else that really struck me as well, is self-advocacy. How do we empower those of color in our families and our extended networks to really take a different look at clinical trials? I did some focus groups recently, and there was one woman, she was adamant, I will never be in a clinical trial. They are not going to treat me like a guinea pig. I don't trust these people. We kept talking, and I kept finding out, well, why do you feel that way? How have you come to that decision? You know, is there anything I can do to help you change your mind? And we talked for about 30 minutes, Dr. Williams, and at the end she goes, you know what? I'm going to give this another thought, okay? The more I dig, the more I peel the onion, she knew that she really didn't have a good reason for not being in the clinical trial. And in her case, it was the treatment of last resort, you know, the clinical trial, because every other treatment had failed. So the doctor said, you need to try this. And she hesitated and, you know, didn't know. But after I spoke to her, she really saw that it was something that she needed to take a look at. So, you know, that one-on-one stuff, you know, I do a program called Kitchen Talk, you know, just sit and talk to folk. You know, I mean, come on now.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, in the Black community, and certainly it extends to the Latino and Asian, it's about family. It's about community. If you engage and address that, you can break down some of those barriers, but it's not going to happen overnight. You've got to make a commitment. You've got to make the investment, and you hopefully will sustain that investment. And up to this point, it's been very few companies that have substantively, aggressively partnered with the right groups who can help them on this journey. You cannot do it alone.
You cannot, absolutely. You know, and, you know, when we talk about self-advocacy and involvement in trials, you know, I think it's so imperative that we also say, hey, listen, okay, you don't want to jump in the pool? Let's dip our toe in. Do a survey, right? See how you like that. Enroll in a research registry. right? Do something focused on diet, exercise. I used to do clinical research all the time. I used to be in those focus groups, where they pay you $20 to try on some jeans, market research. Listen, I was trying on all the dreams. I was drinking all the Coca-Cola, doing all that stuff, right? So if you don't want to start with a clinical study, start with something small, right? You can still participate. Or if you try and you don't qualify, it doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do. There are so many ways that you can participate in moving the needle and improving the knowledge and making things better, right? So my other admonishment is don't give up. Start with something small and then work your way up. You're like, you know what? Listen, that study, helped build this such and such knowledge. So let me try this here. Right. Let me try that. Or just because I can't do that, let me try this over here. There are many, many ways that people can do ways.
You also said something in your remarks about if you're not getting the kind of support from your physician, find another one. Okay.
Yes.
Go move on.
We talk a lot about firing your doctor.
It's not successful, right? That's not acceptable. You need to find somebody and hold their feet to the fire.
Exactly. And the thing about it is with a chronic condition like MS, it really is a partnership. It's somebody you're on a journey with, and you need to be comfortable with that person, so if you don't feel comfortable, if you feel like your concerns are being ignored, then it's okay to seek a second opinion, and I think that that's very important. Sometimes we have this sense of loyalty that we don't need to have, it's like that person diagnosed me and I'm like, well, you're doing worse. So go see somebody else,
Something wrong, right?
Exactly. So don't be afraid to get that second opinion and, get some other information.
That's exactly right. And there's no doubt that it's easy for us to say, but if you're living with a disease like MS and you're obviously challenged in so many ways, but you have to step up to the plate and take charge and control of your health. That second study I presented about the unequal treatment, that term unequal treatment is civil rights language, okay? They deliberately chose that title. So clearly, this is not a privilege to get quality care. It's a civil right.
Right.
So clearly, we have to make sure that we demand quality service. And if we feel we're not getting it, move on, because this is the country that, enables everybody to achieve their best. Economically, educationally, we can do that in healthcare. You deserve the best. My mom used to say, health is wealth. Okay.
That's right. Absolutely. So I guess we'll see if Stuart wants to come back up. Listen, we can sit here and preach all night.
Amen.
But let's have Stuart come back up and see if we have any questions from the audience.
And you all can. And I want to thank you firstly for awesome dialogues that you both had. For everybody that's missed the beginning of this, so after I introduced both Sheila Thorne and Dr. Williams, they each did a presentation on different things that we had them speak about, historic viewpoints to this, and about the medical aspects of diversity and health equities. All right, now now you heard the two of them speaking with each other. We are about to enter the Q&A portion, but I do want to let everybody know that next week we're having part 2 of this dialogue with the two of them, and we will have slightly different topics for them to talk about at that time as well. All right, and that will be on April 13th. But let's get started on the Q&A because I know we don't have a lot of time. Dr. Williams has to go catch a flight, otherwise she's going to get stuck wherever she is right now, and I'm sure she doesn't want to be there. All right.
I do not want to be stuck here.
No, I didn't think you want to be stuck there. I've been stuck there, but you don't want to be stuck. It is a good airport to get stuck in, but overnight is just a drag, right? All right. Yeah. So let me begin with something. I'm not going to say who the question is for because it's for both of you, so you guys can figure out how to answer it. All right. All right. Going first with what you were talking about with self-advocacy. Sheila, you were mentioning that things to do with the self-advocacy, and Dr. Williams said this as well, but I want to add something to this. I have spoken with a lot of people of color and others as to what they really know about Tuskegee, and they know nothing.
Nothing.
Okay? They've heard that, from elders that maybe they shouldn't be involved in a trial, but they don't know why, other than to say that I was told not to do it. But, had they really understood what was going on with Tuskegee, they might have known that, might really have not a lot of value for what they really need to know more about. What can you each say about this?
Well, I'll say one thing very quickly and let Dr. Williams expound, but most of the people I talk to think the government gave the participants syphilis, not
Which
that they
is
were denied
incorrect.
care. Okay,
Exactly.
so that urban legend has morphed into something that is totally not true. So we clearly need to understand the dynamics of that study. And the subtitle of this study was Watching the Progression of Syphilis in the Adult Negro Male. So the intent of the trial was wrong from the very beginning. So we cannot use Tuskegee as a crutch, as to say, well, you know, we can't do anything about that. So I'll stop there and let Dr. Williams respond as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it essentially started as an observational study, you know, because there was no treatment. And so essentially with conditions, you know, the scientific community wants to know what happens as it progresses. You know, now usually it's not restricted to a certain population, right? So we would have expected, you know, a fair study to be everybody, right? And to look at everybody and see what happens over time. The issue became that once the cure became available, it was not offered to the patients. And so basically they continued to watch these people suffer and eventually die from syphilis when there was a cure, right? And that's what made it so unethical. Now, since that time, there have been many things put into place to try to keep that from happening again. So for instance, if I wanted to do a questionnaire for my patients, I got to get a whole, you know, review board to look at it, approve it, make sure the questions are okay. So you can imagine by the time you get to actually dealing with conditions, giving some type of medication, I mean, it's very, very restrictive, right? You know, to prevent abuses, you know, so there are many, many more laws in place, and there are many studies that don't get approved, you know, because they're not considered ethical. You know, so I think that that's a reassurance, you know, that there are processes in place to try to prevent things like that from happening.
And Stuart, you know, this was happening in Guatemala around the same time, 1946 to 48, where they deliberately injected prisoners and those who were so-called the marginalized communities with syphilis. That was uncovered just recently. And so these abuses have been happening since colonial times. This is, again, not new. And in the book, I think, Stuart, you and I talked about Medical Apartheid by Dr. Harriet Washington.
Very good
really
book, but a hard read. It's a hard read.
Dr. Williams, I couldn't read it. I had to put it down. Okay. But again, that history is known. The sterilization of Puerto Rican and Mexican women during the eugenics movement. I mean, that stuff is there. So Tuskegee is the least of the tip of the iceberg with abuse. But we got to counter that by education.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, next question. Person writes, we need to understand better what clinical trials entail. If one is doing great on their therapy, why would we want to participate in a trial where we have been given a placebo or otherwise? So I don't know if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I can start. So essentially, clinical trials, you know, in the traditional sense, when we're talking about medications, are looking at one therapy generally versus another therapy. Now, early on in the history of MS trials, back in the 90s, back in the early 2000s, when we didn't have 20 different therapies, there were placebo-controlled trials. So basically, you had to prove that you were better than placebo, which is no medication. Now that there's been more history and we have more therapies, it's essentially considered unethical to do a placebo-controlled trial for multiple sclerosis. Okay. There was recently one done for primary progressive MS for one of our medicines, ocrelizumab, because there was no approved treatment. So essentially, you can't do placebo unless there's no approved therapy for that condition. So nobody is doing placebo-controlled trials anymore for multiple sclerosis. It's always against an active comparator. So everybody's on some type of medicine. Now, you know, when you talk to your physician about, you know, entering clinical trials, generally, if someone is stable on their therapy, they don't go into a clinical trial. But usually if they're in line for potentially a switch, then that's when that will be broached. So it's not common for someone to take someone off of a medication that they're stable on and enroll them in a clinical trial.
Sheila, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think she explained it well. And the person who asked the question is very insightful. Yeah, they're all different kinds of trials.
The person that asked the question also just wrote, thanks so much, Dr. Williams. So thank you for that. All right, next person. writes, what are your thoughts regarding the consent for studies? Do you believe possibly that the wording is a factor in the decision of minority groups to participate?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Dr. Williams, to start out, because the informed consent document is daunting, sometimes 15, 20 pages of what you have to know, and each page has to be read and initialed and so forth. The language is very, very complicated. And so many of those that I've worked with in trials trust the doctors. Says, should I sign? They don't really know what they're being told to do. So that definitely is a problem. And to translate into other languages, huge problem. So you're not even translating it into my primary language. So again, that informed consent document needs to be updated, and you need to sit with somebody, have somebody with you that can help you walk through it, whether it be an advisor, a spiritual advisor, a legal advisor, to kind of make sure you understand. But the bottom line, Stuart, you can always drop out of a trial. If you're not comfortable, if it's not working right for you, you can say, you know what, I'm not doing this. And there's no prohibition, there's no penalties for doing so.
Absolutely. And that's such a key point, Sheila, that you can withdraw consent, right? But it's important not to make a snap decision, to have, those coordinators, those people who are in the community to really sit down, explain that process. If you want to go home and look at it, I have many patients that want to go home and look at it. Oftentimes people have someone in the family who's a healthcare provider who may be involved in research that can help them navigate and think through it. All of those things are important before you sign, but know that if you do participate, and you become uncomfortable or something happens, you can absolutely withdraw. It's not written in stone. You're not stuck in there.
That's right. And you're not penalized. You're not going to lose your doctor. You're not going to lose any benefits.
Absolutely.
If you decide that I don't want to do this anymore. That's totally your right.
Absolutely.
Okay. So another person writes, how often do doctors receive information on studies that are out there? Like, for instance, my doctor never talks about research. Are doctors updated on doing this with their patients? I've been on my own advocate for looking in on these trials. So how do we get the doctors to talk more about it with their, even with their patients of color? It's another POC.
Yeah.
But
yeah. So, that is often where you receive care becomes a big factor. So most of our academic centers, right, or most of our multiple sclerosis centers where people have some type of specialty in MS do conduct research studies. Now, it's not like there's a bulletin that goes around that says this is all the studies that are available. They often are participating in particular studies, so those are the ones that they can offer to their patients. If you are seen more in a general neurology setting where they're not conducting trials, then they may not be aware of many of the trials that are going on. So often what I encourage people to do is, if there is an academic center close to you, often you can just call up the research department, right, and say, are there any trials going on? And they'd be happy to, tell you about, kind of give you some screening information or send you information. Also, there are websites you can look at. I know NMSS has a list of some trials, MSAA. Clinicaltrials.gov is a little hard to navigate. It's hard for me to read, so I can imagine if somebody, a lay person, is just going on there trying to find a trial, it can be difficult. But usually I say start with the largest, the closest MS center near you, and usually they are conducting some research, and you can start there if your doctor is not doing research themselves.
It's important too, Dr. Williams, if you agree with me, that the doctors who you're asking to refer patients are given some kind of incentive, because clearly Absolutely. That patient becomes out of the practice and they may have a concern that I'm going to lose this patient. Right. So we need to really involve that referral doctor into the process and make it attractive for him or her. So I've heard that from many physicians. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so, that's a great point.
So everybody knows we're in the tail end now of building a new website. And part of that new website is going to have links for where there are research studies happening. And so, we're looking forward to getting this published. Hopefully, really hopefully in the next few weeks that this is going to go live, and soon we'll be able to fill in those categories as well. So we're going to reach out to our medical community of doctors, and we want them to provide us with the list of what they have, what they know about, and so on, so that way we can make the information more available for the MS community. Okay?
Awesome.
Just want to let you all know about that. Now, another thing that I brought up, and one of you mentioned about targeted education, maybe both of you did, and I took notice to that because, like this program tonight, we advertised it in so many places, and yet, I thought we could get maybe hundreds of people on here, but we don't. Okay, and so I'm hoping that afterwards we could get hundreds or thousands to watch it when it's on our YouTube channel. But I think it's each person's responsibility to do more for themselves. It's not so much of what's being given to them, but how much, like you also said, about them being their own advocate. And part of being their own advocate is to find events such as this, excuse me, for them to learn from. How do we help to get people to do more for themselves, to be able to find things like this or other programs like you each was speaking about earlier?
Well, if you disseminate the material in culturally relevant venues, that helps. There are over 200 Black newspapers in this country. There are over 300 Hispanic papers. Radio is the medium of choice in the Black and the Latinos community. So you can't just use mainstream media. You've got to use the publications that we go to, that we trust, that we read. And they're often not on the agendas of many of those who do the outreach. And I'm not suggesting you didn't do that, Stuart, because I know how aware you are of all these issues, but you got to really connect with them. With me here in Albany is the president of the Black Newspaper Association, Dr. Benjamin Chavis, who's one of the few remaining civil rights icons who walked with King. These papers are out there, they're weeklies. So we need to use those vehicles that make the most difference to us that we trust.
Okay. All right.
And I would also say, we can't underestimate the impact of, we sometimes get caught up in looking at numbers, right? So we want 100 people, we want 200 people. But let's say we have 10 people that are paying attention, and each of them tells 10 people or talks to 10 people, right? That's an exponential impact that we've made by affecting those 10 people. Also, the way people consume information is a little bit different, So for me, I attend lots of virtual conferences, but sometimes, when it comes on, I'm not in the mood to look at it or learn it, but I might go back later that night while I'm eating a bowl of cereal after the kids go to sleep, and then I can focus on it, and so we can never underestimate the fact that people are getting the information, maybe not in real time, but they are, hopefully getting the dissemination of information. And also, even if we see what we deem to be small numbers, we still could be making a huge impact, even though the numbers are not what we think they should be.
Stuart, you got to do boots on the ground. You got to go to bodegas. You got to go to churches. You've got to go to barbershops and beauty salons, check cashing stores. That's where people go.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I know that Dr. Williams has a hard stop in a few minutes. And so I do want to get on to a question that somebody asked. This person, I'm going to say her name is Deborah. She's a PT. She says she works with patients with MS. 70 to 75% are all Black people. I witness the disparities every day. I'm open in discussing clinical trials. Most of my clients come to me via Dr. E.J. Gettings from Temple University. My clients, though, have very good open rapport with him. And I think that's something that more doctors probably need to do with their patients. What do you each think about that, please? Quickly. So
I know EJ. So I think, again, it takes a village, right? So establishing that trust with patients, people, talking to them about clinical trials, not assuming that they're not going to participate because, they have mistrust or whatever stereotypes people have, is a start, right? So again, there are good examples. And so we have to glean information from the examples that are successful, whether it be clinical trials that had a successful enrollment, or groups that are doing successful education, much of the work like Sheila is doing, we have to glean those lessons and we have to multiply it to different places.
Right. Okay. Sheila, if you don't have anything to say about that, I want to go on to something that somebody else wrote.
Please go on.
Okay. The pandemic definitely, Anne Marie wrote, I'm going to say her name because I know she doesn't care. The pandemic definitely shined a light on how fear and lack of education and information can play a part in the lack of participation in medication. As we learn from this, what can patients do to bring about education, participation, and minimize fear regarding studies and research?
Wow, that's a big question. I do think that we've covered that, but I do appreciate the experience. She's seeing it every day. Got to keep talking about it. It's not one conversation. It's several conversations. Get the advocates, those who have family members with those who are living with MS. Get them involved in it. Put a face to it. You've got to show people that definitely you can take charge of control. It's a repeated conversation. This is not a 90-day wonder. We didn't get here in 90 days, so we're not going to fix this in the short term. It's collectively, same message, repeating it, vehicles, surround sound, I call it, Stuart. Okay, I want to hear it in church.
Exactly.
I want to maybe talk about it in the beauty salon. I want to see it everywhere I go. And then maybe you'll say, I think these people are trying to get my attention.
Right.
Yeah, and I think the other piece that's important is having people who have the experience coming out and sharing their experience, whether it's good, bad, ugly, all of the in between. So people who have participated, because there are some, raising platforms for them to talk about their experiences and share will also help normalize it, right? And so I think we have to normalize it, just like people are now normalizing therapy, right? Sometimes I meet people, they start talking to me about their therapist in the first 5 minutes of me meeting them, right? So we have to normalize. I don't know if that's good or bad, but we have to normalize research, right? And get people out there talking about it who've participated and sharing their experiences as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I don't want to keep going on and on and on because I know that somebody's in a rush to go catch a plane. I do want to let everybody know that is online that part 2 of this program is next week, April 13th. We hope that you can actually get online on time at 7 o'clock. So that way you don't miss anything that happens in the first 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, so I am going to ask that. Yes, announcements will go out about this. And again, we even expect to have this part 1 published onto our YouTube channel before next week's event, so you can catch what was discussed, okay? And you can bring your questions to that next program as well. But for right now, I do want to say, Dr. Williams, thank you very much for stopping in the airport, waiting to catch a later flight, even though you are in delay anyway. And who knows, that flight later on may be delayed again. You may go running off to another concourse and say, oh my gosh, we're late. Okay, so I hope not though. And Sheila Thorne, okay, I apologize for saying your name incorrectly earlier, and I can't do anything to change that right now except edit it for when we take care of that afterwards, all right?
No problem.
But I do look forward to having you both on again next week. I learned a tremendous amount more from even tonight's program. I hope that everybody online learned from it as well, and I cannot wait to share the knowledge that the two of you bring with hundreds and hundreds of more people. So thank you again. Go carefully with whatever you do for the rest of the night and fly safe, okay? Thank you both.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah. Safe travels, Dr. Williams. All righty.
Thank you. All right.